If you want to understand the danger in front of America, do not start with the price at the gas pump. Start with the number that Washington hopes you do not stare at for too long, $40 trillion. That is the figure sitting underneath this entire moment. It sits underneath every conversation about inflation. It sits underneath every conversation about the Federal Reserve. It sits underneath every conversation about war, oil, rates, deficits, and the future of the dollar. And that is why this story is more serious than most people realize. A war in the Middle East can raise oil prices. That part is obvious. We have seen it before. But when an oil shock lands on top of a nation already carrying a debt burden this large, you are no longer looking at a normal inflation scare. You are looking at a system that may not be capable of using its old cure without injuring itself even more badly. That is the real problem. People throw around the word stagflation as if it were just another television term. It is not. It is one of the ugliest combinations in economics because it traps policymakers and punishes ordinary people from multiple directions at once. Prices rise, employment weakens, growth slows. The economy does not give you the courtesy of failing in one clean way, it fails in layers. The United States learned that lesson the hard way in the 1970s. Most people remember the surface of that period: oil embargo, gas lines, public anger, high inflation. They remember that life felt suddenly more expensive and less certain. But the deeper truth was that the oil shock did not create the entire disaster from nothing. It collided with a monetary system that had already changed character. Once the dollar was severed from gold, the constraints on monetary expansion became much looser. That did not guarantee immediate chaos, but it removed an important form of discipline. Inflationary pressure built. Then the oil shock hit. And what had been building quietly became impossible to ignore. That is a pattern worth studying. An external shock often gets blamed for everything because it is dramatic and visible, but the shock usually matters most because it strikes a structure that was already vulnerable. The spark gets the headlines, the dry timber does the real work. Today, the dry timber is everywhere. Oil is volatile. Again, supply concerns are real. Energy is pressing into transportation costs, industrial costs, food costs, and household budgets. Inflation is not comfortably gone, whatever the slogans may suggest. The labor market is losing some of its earlier strength. Bankruptcies are climbing. Credit stress is showing up in places that grew too comfortable with cheap money. Commercial real estate remains a stubborn overhang. Even areas that were supposed to power the next great expansion are quietly trimming expectations. And yet, the most important weakness is still the debt. I keep coming back to that number because it changes the meaning of every other number. If America had a clean balance sheet, the Federal Reserve could respond to a fresh inflation wave with far more confidence. It could raise rates, absorb pain, and restore credibility the ugly way if necessary. That is more or less what happened when inflation had to be broken decades ago. The medicine was harsh, but it existed. Now imagine trying to administer a similar dose in today's system. The federal government is already running heavy deficits. Interest expense is already large. Every refinance rolls debt forward at a higher cost if rates stay elevated. Households are more rate sensitive than they look. Corporations that finance themselves in the era of easy money are not eager to discover what truly restrictive capital costs feel like. Asset prices have spent years being conditioned by liquidity. Politics has become allergic to short, honest pain. So when people say the Fed can simply do whatever it takes, I always ask the same question: at what cost, to whom, and for how long? A central bank is not omnipotent. It can print money. It can alter liquidity conditions. It can influence credit. It can shape behavior at the margin, but it cannot repeal arithmetic. If debt loads are too large, the range of tolerable policy responses narrows. That is where America is. Now, the country still talks like a superpower with infinite options, but its debt load behaves like a constraint. That is why I believe many investors are still looking at this environment through an outdated lens. They remember a long period in which every serious problem eventually triggered some version of rescue, easing, stimulus, or accommodation. They came to believe that the system always finds a way to cushion the downside, and in nominal terms, it often does. But nominal stability and real wealth are not the same thing. A government can keep the machinery moving while the currency does more of the adjustment. A market can rise while purchasing power falls. A saver can feel safe and still become steadily poorer. That is the trick inflation plays on people. It does not always arrive as a crash. Sometimes it arrives as a slow rearrangement of what your money can command. And the real world, the 1970s offered a brutal education in that reality. If you kept too much of your wealth in dollar claims and conventional financial assets without respect for inflation, you learned that a flat or mildly positive nominal return could hide an enormous real loss. People looked at account statements and missed what was happening underneath. The currency was doing the damage. Their labor bought less, their savings bought less, their future became more expensive while their financial habits stayed the same. Meanwhile, Assets that stood outside the pure paper system behaved very differently. Gold did not become valuable because society suddenly discovered a new use for it. Gold repriced because confidence in money and policy discipline was being repriced. In a decade when paper promises lost credibility, an asset outside that promise structure responded accordingly. That does not mean every period is identical. I do not believe in lazy repetition, but I do believe in incentives. And the incentives today point in an uncomfortable direction. When a government owes this much, there is a constant temptation to solve problems through nominal growth, inflation tolerance, financial repression, and the subtle erosion of the real value of obligations. Policymakers rarely stand in front of a camera and say that directly. They prefer softer language. They talk about flexibility, support resilience, soft landings, and managing transitions. But the underlying temptation remains the same. Make the debt lighter in real terms by making the money less demanding. That path is politically easier than a true purge of excess. A true purge means higher real rates, defaults, bankruptcies, layoffs, repricing, and public anger. Democracies do not choose that path gracefully. They avoid it, they postpone it, they spread it, they hide it in the currency. Now, place an oil shock on top of that incentive structure and you have the outline of the problem. Higher energy feeds, higher prices pressure the central bank. The central bank can tighten only so far before debt service, refinancing pressure, and systemic fragility begin to scream. If it stops short, inflation is not truly defeated. If it goes too far, the debt structure protests. Either way, ordinary people absorb the cost. This is why I say the issue is not simply whether oil goes to one number or another in the next month. The issue is whether the United States can still impose real monetary discipline on itself when the debt tower is this large. I am skeptical. And if I am right to be skeptical, then one conclusion follows immediately. People who measure safety only by nominal account values are taking more risk than they think. I would much rather ask a different set of questions. How much of my wealth depends on policymakers behaving perfectly? How much of my future is trapped inside a currency that may need to absorb the burden of national over-indebtedness? How much exposure do I have to assets that look stable only because I am measuring them in units that themselves may be deteriorating? How much of what I own is real scarce and outside the reach of financial engineering? Those are not fashionable questions during bull markets. They become essential questions in monetary transitions. I have no interest in panic. Panic is expensive, but complacency is expensive too, and often more so because it feels respectable, right? Up until it becomes disastrous. America still has strengths. It remains productive. It still commands enormous global influence. The dollar still matters more than any alternative. Innovation still exists. Capital still wants to gather where law, scale, and deep markets exist. None of that should be dismissed, but strength does not erase debt arithmetic. A great business can become a poor investment if you pay too much for it. A great nation can weaken its own money if it finances too much through promises that cannot be honored honestly without political pain. A reserve currency can remain dominant while delivering worse real outcomes to its own savers. That is the contradiction at the center of this moment. The country may continue to look powerful while the real burden quietly shifts downward onto households through inflation and currency dilution. People may think they are getting ahead because their house price rose, their stock index rose, or their wages rose, while the underlying unit of measurement lost more integrity than they noticed. That is why I keep returning to purchasing power. Purchasing power is harder to manipulate rhetorically. It cuts through slogans. It asks only one blunt question: what can this money actually do for me after the system has had its way with it? In the 1970s, that question separated the prepared from the unprepared. The stock market gave many investors a lost decade in real terms. Cash steadily shrank, bonds suffered, and gold moved from a fixed world into a repriced world with astonishing force. Again, I do not need mythology to make that point. I only need the historical record in an era of inflation, currency stress, and policy uncertainty. Claims on paper wealth often disappoint, while assets perceived as protection against monetary disorder gain dramatically. So what would I do in an environment like this? I would first stop assuming that conventional diversification is enough if all the diversified assets are still claims within the same broad paper framework. I would stop confusing nominal gains with financial progress. I would want a strategy that acknowledges inflation not as a temporary annoyance, but as a possible policy outlet. I would want part of my life anchored in things that do not rely entirely on central bank credibility. I would want to think in decades, not in press release cycles. And I would take very seriously the possibility that the next few years reward realism more than optimism, because that is what this debt figure is really telling us. $40 trillion is not just a big number. It is a map of reduced freedom. It tells you that policymakers cannot move as cleanly as they once could. It tells you that high rates hurt more quickly than before. It tells you that every external shock now lands on a more fragile fiscal base. It tells you that the old solution may still be described as available while becoming less and less usable in practice. That is why the present oil shock matters so much. If this were only an energy story, it would still matter. But it is not only an energy story. It is an inflation story. It is a debt story. It is a currency story. It is a credibility story. And above all, it is a story about a system that may no longer be able to choose discipline without punishing itself in ways the political class will not tolerate. Once you understand that, the rest of the puzzle becomes clearer. You stop waiting for officials to rescue your purchasing power. You stop assuming that a rising portfolio automatically means rising wealth. You stop treating dollar-denominated comfort as the same thing as lasting security. And you begin to appreciate why periods like this create such a wide separation between those who prepare early and those who continue behaving as if. Yesterday's monetary order is still intact. The 1970s taught one lesson above all when inflation and economic weakness arrive together. The pain is not distributed evenly. It falls hardest on people who trusted stability that no longer existed. That lesson matters. Again, the next stage of this cycle may not look exactly like the last one. The characters will change, the headlines will change, the policy language will change. But if an oil shock is now colliding with the debt structure, the Fed cannot honestly discipline without threatening the whole financial architecture, then the burden will go somewhere. And history suggests where it usually goes: into the currency, into the purchasing power of savings, into the living standard of families who thought prudence alone would protect them. That is why I would not treat this as a passing scare. I would treat it as a warning that the country may be entering a period in which the appearance of stability and the reality of wealth begin drifting farther and farther apart. When that happens, the winners are rarely the people who waited for official reassurance. They are the people who looked at the structure honestly, admitted that the old playbook might no longer work, and positioned themselves for a world where real value matters more than paper appearances. That is the world I believe we are moving toward now. The war may be the trigger, the oil shock may be the accelerant, but the debt is the condition that makes the entire system vulnerable. And until that condition changes, every serious inflation flare will carry a second message underneath it. The Fed can still speak with authority, but the debt may no longer allow it to act with the freedom people remember from the past.